Okay, everyone. This is Gerald Clark today, and I'm here with Julian Polzin. Am I pronouncing that right, Julian? Polzin?
Polzin, but it's fine.
Polzin. Okay, perfect.
Right.
And he's written a book called Beyond Psychotherapy, The Laughing God Behind the Mask. And I had a chance just to read it here the last couple of days. I poked through it about a couple of weeks ago and got some feeling from it. And Julian's offering it on his website, and we'll give you all those links later. But it turned out to be a fantastic book, especially given his background. And I'll try to do it a little bit of justice toward the end here. But I wanted to point out some of the people that he gives a call out to. And if it's okay with you, Julian, I'm going to share the screen and show the front of your book. Is that okay?
Of course.
Okay,
all right.
Let's try that. Hopefully we got the bandwidth to do it. So you should be able to see the book over here. Can you see it okay?
Yes.
Okay, so here's Julian's book, Beyond Psychotherapy, The Laughing God Behind the Mask. And some of the call outs you made to some of the people kind of giving credit to really caught my attention. And two of them were Terence McKenna and Alan Watts, in addition to Aldous Huxley, okay? But Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna were two of my favorites. So let me just scroll down this so people can see the credits and what you did. And some of the topics that are covered in the table of contents, just fantastic stuff, okay? There, I think I've got them all listed there so you can kind of see them. All right, so I'm gonna go to the end and talk a little bit of his biography to give you guys a little bit of a background of what he's all about. You can also get there through his website, which he has listed right here as well. Let me make this a little bit smaller so we can see there, okay. All right, so just up above here, where's your bio? There we go. I'm having trouble with my mouse. I have a gaming mouse and it won't scroll smoothly. Right. Some of my windows, I have no idea why. Okay, there's Julian. Okay, he looks like Brad Pitt a little bit, right? No, I'm kidding. Okay, so Julian studied practical philosophy at the Westfälische Wilhelm Universität Münster University. Am I saying that right? Okay, yeah. With the conclusion of his studies, he started to focus on his writing. When was that, Julian? When did you start focusing on your writing?
Well, what was about 7 years ago, I would say.
Okay.
And, I tried to live as a novelist for 5 years. I was basically writing science fiction stories.
Okay, so after a few years living as a novelist, he started his therapeutic education at the Paracelsus Institute in Münster. Then followed a successful exam in June of 2015, when he received his permission to heal in the field of psychotherapy by the Public Health Office in Recklinghausen. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Aside from working as a psychotherapist, author, and community founder, he studies, practices, and teaches Zen. And I think that's really fantastic that you teach Zen. And I can tell by your writing that you live Zen too. And Julian's website is julian-polzin.de. Is that okay? So let's unshare this, yeah. So we can get back to the discussion part of this. Okay, stop share. There we go. Okay, so is there anything else you want to say about yourself? Because this is really crazy, your path in terms of learning psychotherapy, getting licensed, and practicing the way you're doing right now, because you remind me a lot of what I did as a holistic healthcare practitioner. I didn't take insurance either. So anyway, tell me about where the point came with your Zen studies and your licensing. What happened at that junction? How did you land where you're at?
Well, the thing basically was that when I was writing, I felt a little bit of a disconnect, because when you're writing behind a desk, they, in a sense, you don't meet people on a day-to-day basis. So I didn't feel an impact that I could have made on society through direct interaction. And I'm thinking I'm sitting on this knowledge, but I want to apply it. I want to apply it in a compassionate way. Mm. And I didn't have the opportunity to do it. And this led me to getting this psychotherapy education done. But the mystical inclinations, they came later, after I already started practicing. So the one thing that really got my attention was that, let's say, in my personal life, I was going through a loss. And I was like, well, I'm a psychotherapist. I might as well analyze it. I might as well figure it out. So I started walking on a graveyard, a beautiful graveyard next to my place. And I didn't really know what I was doing, but later it became clear. So I walked there every day and I watched the name on the gravestones, and I start sitting down on a bench and I'm trying to contemplate about this loss that I experienced. So at a certain point, when the pain reaches a certain level of ridiculousness, there's a gap in the illusion. Let's say that.
Mm-hmm.
So then I had the very simple thought, I'm so tired of fighting this pain. So I experienced the surrender of the ego, because you cannot hold on to the ego in that moment.
Right. Can I ask you something without interrupting you? Had you read Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now, before you landed on that bench park or that seat near the graveyard?
Well, shortly after.
Okay. Well, you know, that's what happened to him, right? That's exactly what happened to him. He was hanging out in a park when this happened to him, remember?
Right. So, yeah, we can actually get into that, because shortly after that, I started reading The Power of Now. But so let's say in that moment where I experienced this moment of surrender, where the identity drops, because this painful state, let's say when it reaches a critical mass, it implodes. So it implodes, and suddenly I feel the consciousness beyond the brain. So not the thinker, but the observer of thought suddenly is there, right? This is an awakening. So first, no mind state. And what then happens, I regularly start meditating. So going on the graveyard was a metaphor for death. I try to, in a way, find a peaceful attitude towards impermanence, right? So it was an active attempt at dying, and an active attempt at dying is meditation. It's going beyond the ego. This is the death of the identity, right?
You explained this so well, by the way. I love how you define your terms, and you just slip it in the conversation. It just comes out so naturally, and you do this in your book as well. It's very well written. Right. I just want to say. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Well, this is the thing where it gets interesting, because suddenly I start writing about Zen. And since you read the book, you notice the precision of the writing. So when I wrote it, I was baffled, because it seemed to be intuitive knowledge to me. I was like, my identity is one of a German guy. I'm born in a Western society. Like, I've been going through the Western conditioning, let's call it the software, because every society runs on a software. So I'm going through this conditioning, and this is what I know. And suddenly I write about Zen in a detail that, in a sense, it's not rationally explainable with the identity of the German psychotherapist.
Right.
Right?
And it's quite ironic, too. Right? It's very ironic.
Well, at first, maybe if the psychotherapist would have a materialistic mindset, right? But I see more something coming into fusion, something coming into union. But let's say, then I start reading The Power of Now. And I find the writings that I was writing about Zen, they are very much in harmony with what is being written in The Power of Now. And I'm awestruck, because I'm like, oh, I'm tapping in the same source. This is the same universal source. So this is when I realized something was happening.
Yeah, I was fascinated by that, and especially on page 22, where you were talking about, I guess, the portals to the now, which we seem to agree that the body is one of the best portals ever. And Krista and I met, my wife, while we were reading The Power of Now. It was really very interesting, the synchronicity of that. And I had read it, but I was rereading it and found out that she was reading it at the time. And so I like all the various teachers like Alan Watts, the ones you called out. And I think Eckhart Tolle and he was German, right? He did a fantastic job of synthesizing all these teachers into a lay way of presenting it. And I think you have that ability. And I don't know if you're aware of that in your book. You come across the same way. You did tap into something very similar to what Eckhart tapped into. And it's universal, right? We both know that. So.
Right. this is exactly when you mention certain teachers like Alan Watts, Terence McKenna, Eckhart Tolle, Timothy Leary, so on and so forth. It's like the language that they use, the concepts that they use are different, but the universal principles underlying the experience
Mm-hmm.
that we make, we might put them into a different frame. We might artistically express them differently, but the experience as such are universal.
Mm-hmm.
And once we start tapping into mystical experience, we suddenly see the underlying principles. We see that these are not opposing belief systems. We see that these are not conceptual structures, but this is just the surface. This is
Mm-hmm.
the description of the experience as such that we all can access, if we're determined.
Right. One of my favorite sayings, and I learned it when I was in flight school. The instructor during the land navigation portion basically would give you parameters, and if you went too far off of the map where you were supposed to be, you'd fail. Right. So one of the things they told us is never, ever, ever make the terrain fit the map. And now we use the analogy that the map is not the terrain, right? When we're talking about words and concepts to just try to describe this universal underlying consciousness, this intelligence that is accessible in various states, whether you're in meditation, sometimes with a drug experience, it brings this about.
Right.
I personally like to have access to it more permanently, so I don't choose the intermittent path. But I think a lot of people find out about an alternative consciousness through drug use or ayahuasca or peyote, mescaline,
Right.
whatever it is, you know.
Right.
And Timothy Leary was big on that in the 60s, as you know. So
Right.
I personally discovered it through structural integration and doing yoga and Tai Chi and martial arts. But I think a lot of, and meditation, and I think a lot of people get there various ways. So I don't want to interrupt you, but where did you go from finding out that you're writing very similar to Eckhart Tolle and tapped into this understanding to establishing the practice, what you're doing now? Because you saw you needed a community outreach, right? Direct contact.
Well, what I realized in psychotherapy that the framework in which we work in is too limited. Because this is something, maybe you've heard of him. There is a very known psychiatrist in the US. His name is Dr. Brian Weiss, and he used to do past life regression hypnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a very scientifically oriented man at first, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So he has this breakthrough experience where let's say he puts people under hypnosis, and when they have a certain phobia, he told them, well, go back to the traumatic experience, right? Because under hypnosis, the ego is suspended, so you can access those memories.
Mm-hmm.
So there was one client where it didn't really work for him. Yeah, he got frustrated because the phobia remained. There was a woman who was afraid of water. So he found an incident where her little brother pushed her into the pool when she was 5, but that wasn't it. So he kept doing it, and at a certain point she says, well, it's 800 before Christ, I'm in Greece, I'm at the beach, there's a gigantic wave coming, it pulls me in the ocean, and I lose the grip of my baby and we both die. After that, the phobia was gone.
Wow.
Now, what does he start doing? He starts, suddenly have hundreds of these clients who access this information, and then he starts publishing. So, and he was afraid of his reputation, obviously, because he was before the head of 2 important institutes. He was teaching psychiatry in university. But suddenly he gets phone calls from colleagues, and they say, we have those experiences too, we just didn't make it public. So when I started doing psychotherapy and I was teaching people mindfulness exercises, and to explain what mindfulness does is basically like this: we all have a software running in the head. Yeah, it's a constant thought process from the morning to the evening, where a lot of people are identified with their thought process. So mindfulness, in a sense, is we're shifting awareness into the body, right? When we're shifting awareness into the body, we have another pole of experience. So our consciousness is not completely trapped in the thought process. So from that moment on, there is a detachment, and we can suddenly observe the software running in the mind. So when I start teaching these techniques to clients, they suddenly have mystical experience or experience intuitive insights. And they're like, what is that? I want to know, right? And then I realized, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy is not enough because I'm just replacing, as let's say, a not very adaptive software with a more flexible software. It's more adaptable, but it's still a software. It's still a limitation. Right? But the moment we start healing people and they cease to be neurotic, suddenly they become spiritual because this is the next step in evolution. And from that moment, the psychotherapy systems that we have in place are insufficient. Right? And this is then where I started teaching Zen.
You know, you mentioned something, and it was in your book. I want, if you can you give a definition of the ego and how it turns into what you perceive to be personality? Because it overlaps with what I believe, and I thought you did it very well. Do you want to talk about that? And how,
yeah, sure.
Because this software you're talking about is essentially what we call the brainwashing of the societal and culturalization of, and it's different every country you go to, right? So you go to other countries and all of a sudden you can see the software what's going on in your country, and they go, have you, and the passport people are like, hey, have you been to another country? Because we want to know about it. Did you detect our software? Because we don't want you talking about that, right? Like that. But anyway, so I know what you're talking about, but and a lot of times I do talk about the concepts that are considered normal in terms of who our ancient origins are and things like that. And I know you're aware of that. We're not going to go down that path today, but the idea of what the ego is and personality, I think if you go ahead and talk about those and how, for instance, they can be in a traffic situation and all of a sudden, how do they become mindful so that they're observing their thoughts? If you could give an example of that, because I could give lots of them, but I want you to do it because I think you're going to be really good at it. Okay, is that too much or?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
We can get into that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's say the ego is a narrative. It's a story, right? So let's assume when you get born, you have amnesia. You don't know who you are. But you're suddenly born in a tribal society, and this tribal society has the software that it runs on. Now, in the society, we suddenly get judged by that software, right? So there is an individual ego, but there's also a collective ego, and this is our tribal psychology. Let's say you get born in a native tribe and they have blue face paint. Now, suddenly, the people who have red face paint, they become other. So we draw identity basically through discrimination. So when we get a name, suddenly people around us start attaching opinions to that name. And let's say someone goes to school and they say, well, he's bad at math, he's good at sports, and so on and so forth. Now, when you hear these opinions long enough, they start building structures in the brain, right? Neuroplasticity. So they build up these neuronal structures. And at a certain point, we, let's say, build a software that says, if I behave like this, then I get attention, then I get appreciation. If I don't behave like this, then I get punished. So certain natural parts of us, we start suppressing and they drift into the unconscious. Yeah. So we're left with an abstraction of ourselves, a story about ourselves. And you gave the example of a map, and I think this is powerful. Let's say we have a painter. And we tell this painter to paint a landscape. The moment we confuse the painting for reality, we have identified with an abstraction, right? The ego is simply identity. That means any experience you make, if you draw identity from it, if you create a narrative around that experience, you have identified. And this is attachment. This is what the Buddha speaks of when he says this creates suffering for ourselves. So, for example, if I'm not the physical body, but I have amnesia about it, through my living in this holographic matrix, if you will, through me living in this matrix, I start identifying with the physical component. So when I see physical bodies dissolve, I think there's death. And this becomes my story. And then I live in death avoidance, and this is the ego.
Right.
It's attachment to illusion.
Well, right? that death avoidance, actually, there are organizations around the world that took ownership of that illusion of death, made it more scary, and also said, in order to avoid that, we can give you salvation if you contribute to our museum, for instance. The idea that an organization took that mystery, that transition that's natural, birth and death are so natural in this process, but most people will not sit at a graveyard and do what you did because it's scary. They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to deal with that until the end of their life when it's time to, do what the doctor tells them and take their medicines and waste all their money at the last bit while they get milked for the few resources they have left. That's what I generally see happen to old people. Okay. So,
Right.
so you're exactly right. So where do we go from this cultural software that everybody's running in their head, and all of a sudden they step back and have a mindful experience, and now we're off into the New Age movement in La La Land, right? And then so
Right.
this is the problem I ran into as well as an engineer. Talking about my experience energetically. First of all, talking about the Anunnaki or some ancient origins or some, right? That was weird enough, okay? But the fact that I went through structural integration and my body started changing and I was having one energetic experience after another, I needed to understand that. And I wrote a paper back, I guess it was 2002, called Structure is Function and Energy. And and the bottom line was I found out that, yes, we're an energy body, multiple layers, and there's somehow a fusion of the material form with that energetic form that when they are kind of synchronized, some pretty sick magic happens. And I've written some about that, but I usually don't talk about it in detail. but I'm with you. I experienced that too. And so it naturally led to meditation. And I studied Zen. I studied all the different practices until I got to a formless form of meditation, which now I try to have on all the time, right? So whatever I'm doing, it's a meditation, pretty much.
Well, at a certain point, let's say meditation, if you will, meditation is not an act. It's not something we do. At a certain point, we realize that this is our deeper state of consciousness to begin with. It's just obscured.
Exactly.
Right?
That's a good way to say it.
So when people meditate in the West, they try to add something to themselves because the ego story is I'm insufficient, I'm lacking, so I need to improve, right?
Right.
And this is exactly what keeps the cycle of thought going and going and going, because it's kind of like this: if you're sitting at a lake and you're trampling the water with your feet, right? You create waves, and then you cannot see the reflection, you cannot see yourself, right? So if I try to, in a sense, defeat fire with fire, if I try to conquer thought with thought, I'm just going to create more chaos in the lake, so I cannot see my reflection. Right?
I love that analogy. I love that analogy that a thought, because I think I've seen some Buddhist masters say something to the fact that, if you want it, you can't stop yourself from thinking, but you don't have to give that thought any energy and let it dissipate like the water that's rippling will naturally settle down on its own, like you're saying. It's a good analogy. It's a very, very good one. Is this one of the mindful techniques you teach to your clients? Okay.
Yes. The breakthrough for a lot of people comes when they realize that they are not the thought process. And there's a metaphor I usually use to make that very clear. Let's say, and you probably read it in the book, it's the cinema metaphor. So when you go into the cinema and the movie is very compelling, it's very well made, all your awareness is trapped on the movie screen. You forget that you're sitting in the cinema. You forget that there are people around you, right? So let's say it's a horror movie and it creates very intense emotion. If your consciousness is trapped on the movie screen, you experience fear. But if at any point in time you could look around in the cinema or watch your breathing or maybe touch the seat that you're sitting in, you would create another experience. So through the creation of that experience, you experience a detachment, because not all your consciousness is trapped on the movie screen, and suddenly the experience becomes less severe. The same thing happens when we practice mindfulness in this life experience. Because if I watch my breath, for example, at all times, I just watch it, then my consciousness is not trapped in the thought process. So I have created a little gap, a little form of detachment. Now, if I keep this going at a certain point, I realize there are gaps between my thoughts. So we realize things in contrast. If you see a poem written on a page, the only reason you can see it because it exists in contrast to the white page, right? So thoughts exist in contrast to consciousness. and thoughts arise within consciousness and leave consciousness, but we usually don't observe this because we have so many thoughts that we don't realize the gaps. We're too focused on the thoughts.
And nobody gave us a reset button to shut off the computer when we're not using it, right?
Right? And it's not encouraged because through modern media, you constantly, in a sense, let's say when we're trapped on a fight or flight instinct level, our higher cognitive functions are not accessible. And this is how the media basically works. So you have this tribal belief system, and based on this tribal belief system, you get told what is important for your survival. So there's an enemy you have never seen. There is an economical threat that you've never met, but it creates ideas, creates concepts in the mind. Now, our biological system cannot tell the difference between a real threat and an imagined threat. So, simple example, if someone has social phobia and they're supposed to give a speech next day, they will be thinking, oh God, I'm going to embarrass myself, it's going to be horrible, and so on and so forth, right? And they call this imaginary tigers. Because how is our mind structured? Let's say you go into the wilderness, you see a movement in the bushes. If there's a 5% chance that there's a tiger, you got to discriminate. You have to get out of there, right? So it's a black and white mechanism. It's 1 and 0.
Right.
It's pleasure providing or threatening.
Right.
So we have those imaginary tigers because we have thought constructs in the mind that we think are scary. So our biological system responds. So we're suddenly being hunted down by imaginary tigers, and we're being caught on an animal instinct level. So our higher abilities cannot be realized. And this gets constantly, this is constantly being fed by the media. Through news reports, through creating ideas of terrorism, of potential economical crisis, because people who are in a fight or flight mode, they struggle to be intelligent. And intelligent does not necessarily mean the rational mind. We have many forms of intelligence. Right?
Do you think that's intentional? Why do you think people are kept in fight and flight mode by the headlines constantly reporting blood and guts? Or war? Why do you think that is? Is it because they don't want you to access your higher self?
Yes.
For what reason? Just control? Just control the populace? I agree. I just wasn't sure where you were coming from, because that'd be a hard thing to tell your clients, I would think. I don't know.
Oh, they figure this out by themselves.
I know they do now, because I think we're in a different awakening process for humanity. But it seems like you're kind of in a pioneering space by, I don't know, doing what you're doing, because you're not issuing drugs in the traditional thing that a psychotherapist would normally do. And I've been exposed to them before, so I know how this goes. You're a Renaissance psychotherapist that has multi other dimensions to you that just so happens to be you're doing psychotherapy right now. But I think you're serving your community, and you would be doing it in multiple capacities, whatever you decide to do. So anyway.
But the thing is, I'm not a psychotherapist. I have a license, but this is not my identity. This is a role that I play.
Well,
it's a role that I play for mutual benefit, right?
Right. Well, I wouldn't see that as even your identity at all. I see your identity as being much higher than that. I'm trying to figure out which light team you're probably affiliated with that you may not even be aware of. But anyway,
well,
I think you see what I'm saying. I don't see you as taking on what you do as being your identity. I think you're way beyond that. So.
Well, see, in any form of identity is just a manifestation, a creative manifestation of who you are, and it's temporary. And anything that is temporary is not you. It is that simple.
That's hard to explain to people, because they spend their whole life in this physical form with this software running, and for them to realize that they might be an energy form that's eternal, that's just having a material experience in an avatar, that's a lot to wrap your head around. But now we've had the movie Avatar come out, and we've had all these different movies like The 13th Floor, and multiverse is being explored, and all these different things. So I think people may be a little more open to it, but it's a very significant cognitive shift to not see yourself as this meat that dies and then it's over, and oh my gosh, hopefully somebody will save me if I've been good, like that, you know. Versus taking responsibility. I want you to talk about that. You mentioned that in your book about taking that point where all of a sudden you've got to take responsibility for the now, what's happening now.
Right. Well, the thing is, as long as we're trapped in our conditioning, we are unconscious. So the whole idea of good and evil goes out the window. Because if someone is unconscious, they're unconscious about what they're doing. One of the main issues that we have created in modern society, because we are attached to the egoic idea, we have made pain and suffering personal. That means we do not see anymore that certain energies get transferred from generation to generation. They are collective. But when we're trapped in ego, is kind of like this. Nobody wants to pick up the hot potato. The hot potato gets passed down from generation to generation. And it takes, let's say, if a highly conscious being gets born into a less conscious environment, this conscious being has a chance of breaking through the karma that gets constantly passed down collectively. So before we awake to our timeless nature, we're not really conscious, so as such we cannot make conscious decisions, right? And so the idea of good and evil comes from a very profound confusion. So let's say, when I don't know who I am, I experience confusion. We see this in Alzheimer patients, for example, right? They walk down the street, they don't know who they are, they express very intense emotions because they're afraid, right? So if I don't know who I am, and if I have been told the story that I'm a physical thing, or I call it the brain in a body illusion.
I call it a meat modem, but go ahead.
Right. However you want to call it, right? I mean, there's humor to it. There's definitely a lot of humor to it. So when we get told that narrative and we believe it, we think we die. So as such, from confusion arises fear. And the fear comes from the idea of limited time. So I have a limited amount of experience. In that limited amount of experience, I need to squeeze as much experience and pleasure in as possible. So sex, drugs, materialism, the whole thing, right? So suddenly we get greedy, suddenly we get egoistic because we have identified with the physical vehicle. And this is what we call evil, but it is a confusion. It's based on illusion. So those people are not, they are not evil. They just have amnesia of who they are. But of course, we're asking ourselves, well, how can we awaken a society? And this is, I think, where a lot of the work gets misunderstood, because we're trying to convince people with language. We're trying to convince them on concept level. And I'm going to give a very clear example. If I have two biologists and there's only one microscope, and the other biologist is not allowed to look into the microscope, he has to rely on what that person with the microscope says. And this creates belief systems. Suddenly you have created religion. Now that microscope is meditation, or regression hypnosis, or the psychedelic experience. The microscope is the technique that gives you access, direct access to the mystical experience. Now, what we need to provide to people is direct access to the mystical experience, because if you just talk to them, they shut the door. It's kind of like this. They did an experiment with chimpanzees a while back. They had some that were living in a zoo for a long time, and they tried to bring them back into the wilds. They find this beautiful lonely island, and they open the cages. And the chimpanzees had a hard time leaving the cage, because this was the comfort zone. This was their matrix. This is what they were identified with. And the mystical is to them the abyss. It's the unknown. I don't want to step out of my cage. So when I try to pull a person out of their cage, it's a form of violence. They're just going to run back into the cage, kicking and screaming, right?
I love that part of your book. that part where you wrote about, and if I can add to it, you said something to the effect, if somebody is happy being entertained by the illusion, that you should not be imposing a wake up on them because it was violence. And that struck me so profound. You want to talk about that anymore? Because I think that's a really profound point, because people that end up serving their community, they're like, oh my God, I got to get 100,000 people on YouTube so I have some indication that I've been serving my community. I'm waking them up, right? You can't wake anybody up, right? But you can inform their will and let them do what they will, right? So I want you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, waking someone else up is a form of ego trip, and it actually comes from a hidden fear. Let's say, if I experience myself as more sensitive and more perceptive and more intuitive, but I live in a society that is materialistically oriented, right? Then I might feel threatened by that environment. Now I want to wake people up, but I don't want to wake people up for their own sake. I want to wake them up because I don't feel endangered by them then. So that's a control trip. So the ego gets back in the back door. And I want to make this very clear. At a certain point, the Marxists, the communists, thought they were more woke than the rest. So they start imposing communism on everyone, right? So the moment we think we have found the truth and we start preaching it, we start imposing it, we're just replacing a narrative with another narrative. But any narrative is illusion. So if I try to impose someone on something, I act from a level of attachment. Fear is in there. Right? So I don't know if you're familiar with the Taoist principle of Wu Wei. Have you ever heard about that? Yeah, but I'm going to explain it for those who don't know.
Definitely, go ahead.
So Wu Wei is something that comes from Wu Xin, and Wu Xin means empty mind, no mind, basically. So Wu Wei means non-action. Usually when we feel an impulse to act, it is reactionary. It is from conditioning, right? So, and conditioning comes from the past. So if we act on past memory, we only recreate the past over and over again. This is our karmic trap.
Right.
So in order to do this, I need to detach myself. I need to be aware in the present moment, and the present moment is the timeless. This is where I create a gap. I create a portal within myself where the real me can, through intuition, feel into this experience. So what happens, for example, in psychotherapy, if I would be attached to the idea of a therapist, let's say there is a client and whatever I do does not work well. If I'm attached to the idea of a psychotherapist, well, then I get violent. Then I'm starting reinforcing the techniques because I'm the psychotherapist. I'm supposed to know how it works. So suddenly my ego is involved, right? I got to fix this person because my identity depends on it.
Exactly.
So if I do the opposite, if I go into meditation and I just allow, then suddenly whatever response comes after I have created a gap in thought. And this response is non-violent and is appropriate in alignment with what this being in front of me is currently experiencing.
I think that's...
But this right?
Yeah, perfect. That's perfect, yeah.
But this does not come from a need. Right? So as long as we are attached to this reality in some way or form, let's say if I give a person a gift, but I secretly have a hidden motivation. If I give this person a gift, this person got to do something nice to me next time. I have already contaminated this action with ego, right? So there is attachment involved in this, right? So as long as we act from attachment, we cannot call ourselves liberated. And as long as we do this, we think we're doing something for someone else, but it's actually an ego deed.
Yeah, the ego is very slippery. There were two tenets in Tibetan Buddhism to overcome: purify your consciousness and subjugate your ego. And they spend their whole life doing that. And it's so easy to say, but you could spend your whole life doing that. And especially the ego, because that filter is cumulative and it took a long time to build up, right? And you have all those emotions attached to it that in the context, like you said, if you're acting as a response to something that's already in your memory, then you're acting out and repeating that and perpetuating the past, instead of being at a place where you're in the now, where you can see it for what it is and act from a new place without using your old green garbagey highway of memory, right? So this is the hard part. So
and if you act from the now, this intuitive part and this new place that you're speaking about, that is creativity. And what does that mean? That means the creator is involved. You become conscious as a creator. And this is when responsibility kicks in.
Okay,
because from that moment, Because from that moment, let's say something that got pretty clear to me when I had a psychedelic experience where, let's say, I saw my non-physical body. So I realized, oh, that's me. And it's this light being, this energy form. And I see physical bodies around me changing. And they look like a mirage. They're transparent. I see them changing around me, but I'm not changing, but these bodies kept changing. So I realized, oh, I'm not a body. And from that moment, I experienced a tremendous form of liberation because the fear of death was completely gone. But not only that, suddenly there is compassion arising. Because you still kind of know how you suffered before you got there to that experience of realizing yourself beyond the physical. So suddenly you look at the people around you and you realize, oh, they're suffering. They're still trapped. But once you realize yourself as that, you do know ultimately there's nothing to fear. Yeah, you can be shot, you can be tortured, you can be whatever. You just wake up.
Yeah,
this is what's going to happen.
That is such an important point that you brought up, and I think that's common among the people who've had some sort of energetic experience and experienced themselves apart from this. Right, that's the key. And that started happening to me when I was 14 or 15. I was having out-of-body experiences over and over and over. And I didn't even know it was happening until I was 17 when I read, and you mentioned Robert Monroe, I think, in one of your references, didn't you?
Yeah.
I read his book when I was 17 to try to understand what was happening to me. But the thing that happened to me was that I didn't realize was I had absolutely no fear of death through my life. And that's why is I understood that I exist apart from this body. And I didn't even have the framework or the concept to understand that until I was much older. But I operated that way because I knew.
Well, and here's the thing. If you would have had a concept, this might have blocked the experience. Yeah, by not having a concept, you experience it naturally, intuitively, right?
That's true. Yeah, that is true. Well, I actually found his book to be so profound when I read it because I knew that's exactly what was happening with me. And actually his techniques were so clear that I was able to reproduce his techniques and actually have an out-of-body experience pretty much anytime I wanted to for many, many, many years. And then all of a sudden, as an adult, that ability started slipping away. And then it started happening more intermittently. I don't know where you're at with that, but I still like that experience. It's some of my most memorable experiences to have those. So, you have anything to say about that, or?
Well, to be sincere, I didn't have any out-of-body experience yet. At least not without an amplifier, right? Like speaking about the psychedelic, I mean, most of us know the movie Matrix is the red pill that Morpheus offers to Neo, right?
Right.
Here, take this. That's the psychedelic. That's the glitch in the Matrix, right? I have been practicing, but I haven't been successful yet. I got into the vibrational stage a few times, but I couldn't separate. And I'm still working on the Kundalini. So I'm a little bit drained in my energies. So it's a process. Sometimes it's like when you have past life memory, it's, for example, it's a blessing, but it can also be a hindrance. Because, for example, I know from the past life memory who I was, so I know I did all of this before. So when you know you did all of this before, it creates a new form of ego because I suddenly compete with my own shadow. I'm like, I got to be able to do this. I did this before. I know it's in the writing. Right?
Does it drive you? Does it drive you to push yourself harder?
Yes, but this can be a hindrance sometimes because there's a tendency to overdo things, right? And there's a tendency to lose compassion towards myself. So when I do this and I lose compassion towards myself and I don't treat myself appropriately, the ego has a chance to re-enter, right? So sometimes knowing that you were able to do something before can actually be a hindrance, right? In one hand, it's a huge relief because I know what is possible. But and this is something that's actually quite humorous and funny, because even if you experienced a state that some would call enlightenment in a previous life experience, once you get reborn, you have to get through the ego again. Because there are all these barriers, there are all these blockages, right?
Yeah, actually,
so,
oh, go ahead. I was going to tell you this little model that I have, and I know you're aware of the chakras and all that, but in the
Right.
divine vision of Hermes, and Poimander tells him about the aspects of his soul and what's given up when you die and when you come into this experience. And it's funny, some of those aspects and how they seem to be correlated with the cycle masters right out of the Emerald Tablets from Thaw, where he talks about
Mhm.
their, so imagine you come up to your third chakra, just for instance, in your spiritual development, and you run into whatever spiritual lesson is that you're supposed to get through there. Well, each one's kind of
Right.
different. So I see our consciousness as quantized states, coincident with the wavelengths that are truly generating, I don't know, a superposition wave of that energy that is your biosignature from your
Right.
chakras. Of course, I'm an electrical engineer, so I see things a little differently
Right.
than other people. But
But that's important. That's important that you see this differently, because I think what we're now seeing in the upcoming global consciousness, we see this with the emergence of the internet. We are developing collective intelligence, right? That goes beyond nations, borders, identities are breaking down. That's the good news. So what we are now seeing is that science and mystical experience are merging. Science has now entered this fringe level where suddenly the mystical experience will be accessible to science at a certain point. Psychedelic research is part of it. Near-death experience research is part of it. Regression hypnosis and all these endeavors. I think quantum physics brought a breakthrough. And the reason for this is that, let's say I try to describe it like the impact of consciousness on matter. Let's say when we start doing yoga, for example, we start modifying the body, right? But we cannot be the body if we're modifying it. If I observe my thoughts, I cannot be my thoughts. So that means consciousness is actually manipulating matter directly. So what I experienced in meditation, when I activate my third eye, for example, and I look at my environment, things become transparent. They are vibrating. Sometimes I see the ground move on which I sit, so I can see that space-time is not rigid. It moves like in an ebb and flow. And the reason I can see it is in that moment when I suspend the ego, what I look at doesn't know how to respond. It's irritated. It doesn't know what to show me. Yeah, because you have these experiments in quantum physics when you realize the moment you observe the experiment, you're manipulating it, right? But the moment I suspend the ego observer, whatever I look at, whatever particle, and all of it is intelligent. The moment I look at it, it doesn't know what to show me. So suddenly I can see their energy fields around people. And I see vibration. If I hold the leaf in my hand and I watch it long enough, I can see it become transparent to a certain degree.
oh,
And the humor that enters, for example, in psychotherapy, picture someone sitting in front of you, and they're very trapped in the ego story, and they're telling this very sad story that they identified with. And then you see a shining energy field around them. You see a little god complaining about being trapped in limitation. This is the laughing Buddha when you see it. It becomes quite humorous.
yeah, I get that.
From that perspective.
I used to have a energy body imaging system. I had two of them as part of my structural integration practice. So I was doing these structural changes with the malleable body, exactly as you said. The mind and body are linked. Okay, you can't change the body without changing the perception of that being in some way. They're very much related, and also energetically, like you said, from the imaging systems, we can see that if the body is treated like an antenna and it's truly aligned with the gravity field, that energy that's coming out of that antenna is quite different than one that's been damaged, for instance. Okay, so this is the kind of work I was doing, but it's very, very real. And that experience of changing reality does hopefully clue you in that you're not a fixed twig that's rigid, that needs to break in the wind. You can adapt, change your energy, change your entire reality. You can manifest a completely different reality if you get control of your thoughts, right? So, let's see. There was something else in your. So, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about if that's all true, and we're energy beings here in an avatar body, what do you see as either individually or collectively what our mission here is? If like you said, trying to waken up others is an act of violence. So how do we, what is our mission here as, do you understand the question?
Yes.
It's kind of a hard one.
I would say purpose is not singular. Yeah, many purposes can exist, and the individual soul purpose might be different. But of course, all waves are part of the ocean, so we move as a collective, and we all feel what everyone feels, right?
Right, right.
So that cannot be separated. But at the same time, even the soul we experienced as individualized, yes, through its experience, because its experiences are unique. But the soul is never under the impression of being separate from the ocean, where the ego perceives itself separate from the ocean. Right? So what we're now facing is, if you will, the ego is an intermittent state in evolution, because you need ignorance to be enlightened. You need light, right, to recognize darkness. You need cold to recognize heat, right? So if you look at a flower that is open and you look at a flower that is half open, you won't judge the flower that is half open. It goes at its space, right? So what I got told in telepathic communication is that the Buddhas are not the ones who interfere with the game. They offer service. So it's kind of like this. If I do psychotherapy, people come into me in times of crisis. And I give a very clear metaphor of identity loss. Let's say you have a world-class pianist, and this world-class pianist suddenly gets arthritis in his hand, so he can't play anymore. So the ego is dead in that moment. The identity of the pianist dies, right?
This is Dr. Strange's story.
Yeah?
The movie Dr. Strange, that was his story. The surgeon, his hands were gone, so his identity was gone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's the thing. So we identify with certain abilities or experiences and circumstances, right? But everything here we will lose, so we suffer. So in that moment of suffering, there is an opening. There's an opening, and you can provide catalyst. And the catalyst is, if you are in a state of egolessness, you become the perfect mirror. Because they will start projecting on you all their unconscious beliefs. And nothing will stick. It's like a Teflon frying pan. Everything slides off, right? So they come to the conclusion, it's my identity, and they start dropping it. So if we act from a level of compassion, then there is a chance of transformation. But in order to do this, I need to be rooted in my being. And if I'm still trapped in identity, I will try to force things on people, and we're just creating more unconsciousness. So the suffering pushes people into awakening, because at a certain, let's say at a certain point, the cost of the ego is too much, because the suffering reaches a critical point, and then people feel the desire to detach themselves from it. And then they seek a psychotherapist, a spiritual teacher, or whatever, but they don't go there to get rid of the ego. They go there to get rid of the depression. This is what they're thinking, right? But then there is a chance to make them conscious of the ego. But this needs to be done at their pace, with a lot of empathy, walking them through the process. So the struggle that we see is in a sense, let's speak about vibration. We attract what matches our vibration. So the more we are aligned with cosmic consciousness, let's say you have a very specific question and you ask that in meditation, suddenly next day you find a book that perfectly corresponds with that question, right? This happens when you reach a certain state of vibration. The information becomes directly accessible to you. But for a lot of people, they're not at that stage of vibration. So they need to have some form of violent incident that makes the identity too costly to maintain. And this is kind of like this. People enter therapy and then they say, oh, it sucks to be such an old caterpillar. Oh, it's so hard to be such an old caterpillar. And they see death, but death is transformation. And that means, of course, the butterfly emerges. So lessening the grip of the physical identity. Right? But we can only do...
I was going to say, do you think the media is intentionally taking place to the Faustian cliff so that there is a wake up, that they're throwing off their identity and waking up? Do you think it's somehow related?
Actually, I think that let's say the mainstream media reinforces unconsciousness. Are you still there? The video kind of froze.
Yeah, I'm still here. I might need to shut mine off. Let me stop my video. You're talking, so I'm going to stop my video. Okay. That'll give us more bandwidth. So I guess if the media is causing unconscious, do you think the side effect of them causing people to reach these identity crises by putting them in their survival mode of their consciousness, do you think they're somehow related? Because there's a lot of people waking up, or do you think there's some outside force?
Well, let's say, a flower opens when it opens, right? So there's a natural process of evolution, and humankind reaches a stage where people had enough past lives, so the intuition kicks in at a certain point of crisis. Now, you can see that beings who have been around for a very long time, they wake up quicker. But it's very interesting because those beings are able to program their experience to a certain degree. So they push themselves a lot of times into tremendously traumatic situations. They write this before they get reincarnated. And the reason is they know that these situations serve as a catalyst to push you into awakening. Because if you're being with experience, you drop the ego early because you cannot survive this experience without doing this. So in a sense, this despair is a catalyst. We can use any catalyst either to reinforce the ego or for awakening. I give you a very concrete example.
Okay.
When I started developing telepathic ability, it's kind of like this. You suddenly start shining like a beacon. So suddenly a lot of entities get interested in you, right? The moment you open up, because suddenly you're emitting this frequency. And I'm like, hey, that's interesting. So what happened to me, I experienced 2 cases that I would call psychic attacks. And they were vicious in intent. But the thing is, they were resonating with something in me that was unconscious. But by doing so, they made me aware of these unconscious parts. So in a sense, they were serving me because suddenly I could work on that. So when we face this despair, if we face it as a teaching experience and not as an enemy, this is the catalyst, this is the fire that burns us into awakening. So suffering can be a friend. Suffering is in a sense the teacher that we require as long as evolution is unconscious. Once we have a certain degree of consciousness, we can turn inward and make it a conscious effort through meditation and other techniques of inquiry. From that moment on, we don't need the catalyst anymore. And a lot of times suffering ceases to manifest as an external physical experience because of that. So in a sense, those people who try to keep the masses under control by making it more and more unbearable to live in this kind of metrics, thought metrics, in this kind of reality, they push them into awakening. At a certain degree, they're basically shooting themselves in the foot.
Right. I agree. Hey, you gave a really terrific example. There's a concept of people manifesting their own reality, law of attraction, that type of thing. And you described 2 different people, one an optimist and one a pessimist, walking through a cemetery and what they saw during a funeral or something like that. And what they saw, and then you mentioned what the Buddhist saw. Can you do that example for people? I thought that was so excellent. So what does the pessimist see? What are they going to see?
Right. So the example was like if someone with a pessimist belief system walks through a city, right? They start focus on the arguing couples, the crying children, the homeless on the street, right? So if someone with an optimistic attitude, we send them to a city, he sees the couples in romance, the joyfully playing children, right? The people sitting in restaurants enjoying food. And then I wrote that the Buddha sees it all and knows no difference. So no matter what belief system we have, no matter what glasses you wear, you can wear glasses that are colored pink. You can wear glasses that are colored dark, right? But it's still a manipulation of your perception. Now, when you cease to manipulate the perception, that means when you look at the world unbiased, thoughtless, in a no-mind state, you see no difference. That means you realize union. And this is the realization of what we call Christ or Buddha nature.
This reminds me of a saying that I heard a long time ago that kind of applies to the ego, and that praise and blame are all the same.
Right.
So, right, and I think it's saying the same thing, but you need lots of examples to wrap your head around this, because look at Facebook, and look at YouTube. Okay, it's designed to create this world of like and dislike, right? And you talk about that in the book as well. Do you want to talk about a little bit about preference as like and dislike, and how it's not really part of the Buddha nature to do that? Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, but I like steak and I like French fries. How can I not like anything? So I want you to talk about that.
Well, like and dislike has a lot to do with attachment. Mm-hmm. For example, you can enjoy sex, right? But if you attach to it, suddenly a fear is involved, is it not?
That's correct.
So one of my clients asked me, how can I tell the difference between attachment and just allowing what is in the present moment? And I said, it's quite simple. Can you have the most amazing sex of your life and walk out of that situation and say, if this never happens again, I'm okay with it, right? So in that moment, you're detached. You still enjoy what's there, but you're not creating identity from this. Mm-hmm. Now, if I say I'm a liberal, if I say I'm a conservative, if I say I'm white, if I say I'm male, if I say this or that, and I create identity, now based on this identity, I might have my likes or dislikes. But that means my likes or dislikes come from a belief system. So it's not created by my environment. So let's bring it back to the idea of tribal psychology again. If the people in my tribe have the blue face paint and another tribe has red face paint, in that moment, when someone tells me my tribe of blue face paint, the people with the red face paint, they're evil, they're dangerous. This creates a concept in my mind. So every time I see a person with red face paint, I see danger. This triggers the emotion because the emotion responds to the thought process. And so the misunderstanding that we have is that our experience creates our emotion. This is completely untrue. What creates our emotion is our belief system. It's just running unobserved. This belief system is our software. And this is something that actually got down in behavioral therapy. There was an American psychologist, Albert Ellis, who nailed it. He said basically, we have A, that's an activating event. We have a belief system. This is our interpretation of the event. We have C, these are the consequences. The consequences are basically our emotional response. So if we cannot observe the belief system, we link A to C. So we say the circumstances have created my emotion, and that's why I suffer. That's why I am in distress. Now, when we find out that our experience actually does not create our suffering, but it's our concepts, in that moment we can liberate ourselves. And then like and dislike fall apart.
I wanted to ask you real quickly, and I struggled with this in my personal path. I, for some reason, in my mind, felt like I had to distinguish between preference and judgment. Like a preference is I like this or I don't like that. But where does that predisposition come from? And sometimes it's very primal, like even in young children where they don't even have a framework, but they prefer this taste over that taste or this color over that color. Where do you think that comes from? And how is that different than like and dislike or judgment to you?
Well, it's even deeper than that, because a lot of people have preference because of past life memory. They just don't know it.
Yeah, that does get
so for example, for example, my father was a lot into Japanese things, into Japanese martial arts and having all these objects around me. So the hints were there all the time. So I had an affinity to Japanese culture, obviously. And when I found out I had past life memories about being Japanese, that completely made sense. So
So you've distinguished between an affinity and a like. Can you help more with that? Because I still don't see the difference between a preference and a like, or
okay.
You see what I'm saying? Because if these are coming, so how, what's the proper response to an object that somehow you prefer this one over that one? Because you can't really change your chemical taste response to it, right? I mean, see what I'm saying? So I don't know where to ground that one.
Okay. Well, maybe let's speak about love, because then it makes sense.
Okay.
See, love, when it's not based on condition, it doesn't discriminate, but you might experience various degrees of love. So you might have 3 children and you love one more than the other, but that doesn't take away that you love the other 2 as well, right? It's just you experience a different degree of love. So liking and disliking has a lot to do with memory. So if you walk into a beautiful landscape and you see a tree, you might be, oh, nice tree. Well, if you might have had the memory as a 6-year-old, you fell out of a tree, you horribly broke your leg, you're like, oh, a tree, right? And this is where liking and disliking comes from. It's based on memory. So this is the identity trap. Now, I can say I prefer a certain ice cream, but that doesn't make me hate the other ice creams. But if I enter a dualism, if I say this is right and this is wrong, for example, I can enjoy something, but someone can enjoy the opposite of what I like. I can still see both as good or both as love.
Right. This is where, this is where I landed in trying to distinguish between preference and judgment. If I preferred something and I didn't say, well, blue is bad because I like red, then I saw the preference as, well, maybe I don't know where the predisposition or the affinity for that came from. It might have come from past life. It might come from, I assimilate that and it makes me feel good. You know, maybe it's, maybe that's what led to me being vegan. I don't know. Actually, it is. You know, I eat something I didn't like the way it made me feel. I'm not eating that anymore. And pretty soon, you know. So,
but the interesting thing is that preferences also change when people increase in consciousness, when they increase in vibration. It's very interesting. For example, like I used to like to play, for example, violent video games or watch violent movies. The more at peace I become, the less compelling is it for me. Yeah, it's just like I watch it. It doesn't create an emotional response within me, but I can feel I'm not interested in this anymore. Like I played that game, I did it, like I entertained myself with that perspective for a while, but it doesn't attract me in that sense anymore. Yeah, but there's still no judgment towards this, because
I get it. Yeah,
you know, there are many stages of consciousness, and every stage of consciousness correlates with a certain level of experience, and all of these experiences are good. There are no bad experiences.
Yeah, so do you find yourself attracted to experiences that take your perceived sense of your energy or vibration to a higher state, more so than other things? Because that's generally what I see happen. You tune into the cosmic universal radio station, and that's the only thing that's really real to you anymore, and the rest of it's just an illusion. So you want to get as receptive with that and connected with that as you can. But that's very interesting. But still, you pointed out that we need to have a little flaw, a little way of still relating to this material experience. I found that to be absolutely true. Do you want to talk about that? And then maybe we'll let you close out, because I think I've had you almost an hour and 15 minutes already. So that little flaw that we need to be able to connect with this reality, how talk about that.
Well, in a sense, I wrote in the end of my book, the reason that we get confused because we attach to manifestation. And everything that is physical is a form of manifestation. This is matter, how it manifests. So our attachment to this world allows us to exist here, right? So a yogi or a Zen Buddhist monk with a certain level can drop the body and they're gone. Right? So we need to have a little personality, a little bit of uniqueness about us, not to drop out of this experience altogether. So there is this old Zen saying that I like a lot. water that is too clear has no fish.
Exactly.
Right?
I remember you writing that in your book. You had lots of those good little allegories like that, or what would you call it? Little snippets of wisdom that were really, really fantastic, that are timeless. And that is true. I found that with myself. Whenever I got too, I don't know, purified, I couldn't relate to anybody, and I felt very ineffective and actually very isolated. So having a few little flaws permissible, you know,
Right.
it helps you
But
connect.
here's the thing. You might remember something that Timothy Leary said. Yeah, Timothy Leary said, "Find the others." Yeah. So once you start awakening, gossip ceases to be interesting. Material goals ceases to be interesting. Any attachment to impermanent attainment ceases to be interesting. Right. So
Well,
from
I
that
want you.
moment,
Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah.
I think I stepped on you, and I don't want to interrupt you. But before you finish with that thought, I want you to define interesting for me, because what you've said is very impactful to me, because I find people, if they pay attention to what they're paying attention to and define what interesting is, it might have a whole lot to do with their path and their destiny. So what do you think about that?
Well, I remember Eckhart Tolle saying at a seminar, he says, "We're not doing anything interesting. If you expect anything interesting, you can leave now."
I remember
So,
that.
so right. So the rational mind is interested in interesting things. The rational mind is interested in stimulation. This is when people, when they get into meditation, right, when they sit down and they tell me it didn't work, and I ask them, how do you come to the conclusion it didn't work? Then they say, well, I sat down, suddenly my thoughts became very, very loud. I felt a lot of anxiety and I couldn't stand and I had to get up. And then I say, well, this shows that it worked. And they're like, what do you mean? And then I say, well, you're always like that. Just now you notice. So the thing is, we're used to having our brain stimulated the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
But once you find that inner connection, that timeless energy, that timeless awareness, suddenly your desires drop. So you lose interest in the superficial, in the material, in the gossip, in the ego talk, in the story, in the narrative. It ceases to be compelling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because you don't identify with the ego anymore, so you don't draw anything from it. You don't draw identity from it. So then people sometimes, they go through the process where we say it's the dark night of the soul, because they're in transformation and they haven't found the others yet. Yeah. So again, think about what Timothy Leary said, find the others.
Can you
Right?
expound on that one more time for people so they get it? Because I think it's a really important point.
Well, the thing is, once we start changing in frequency, we attract experiences that are on the level of that frequency.
Right.
Now, mind you, since we experience here time space, everything is delayed. So on the physical experience, in a sense, the universe needs time to adapt to your frequency. So before the other experiences come in, the deeper experiences that you actually then start desiring, yeah, because then desire becomes singular. Desire is not anymore divided into a lot of different things, but you suddenly develop that, what the Zen monks call single-pointed awareness, single-pointed mind, because your only goal is the source.
Well, that's what I was saying about this
Right?
antenna, like a radio broadcasting, is once you
Yeah.
realize that, that becomes your single-minded focus. And it's very strange how the other things that you used to think were interesting drop off out of your life, right? So,
Right. And then you step out of the matrix. You step out of the thought matrix, out of the software that the culture runs on. And then, of course, to all the people you socialized before, they live in a certain bubble of consciousness. You live in a different bubble of consciousness. But at a certain point, these bubble of consciousness cannot merge anymore because the distance and frequency is too much. So then, of course, people experience a certain level of isolation and alienation because they haven't found the others yet. Right. And I think us talking is part of that endeavor to find the others, right?
It is. It is exactly the fact that there's no boundaries, nor borders. Luckily, you speak English. I speak a little German, but it's been a while. I'm sure you speak fluent German, don't you?
Yeah, of course.
And you don't even speak English with a German accent. So how did you, just for my curiosity, how did you learn to speak English so fluently? with no
Well,
no German accent.
right. When I used to live back in Münster, there were a lot of British soldiers. So I started talking to British soldiers first, but I just happened to have a lot of international friends. And the reason for this is very simple. Germans have a very rigid cultural software. Yeah, they're a little bit like Japanese in that regard. Yeah, they're very fixed on certain specific ideas. And obviously I felt very early I couldn't relate to this frequency of experience very much. So I started seeking people who were international for the very simple reason they traveled. They have seen beyond the software that they experience regionally. So these people, in a kind of sense, were on a different frequency. So I started talking with internationals all the time, and this is how my English developed.
Oh, right? Well, your English is excellent. So I just wanted to say that. Well, I noticed that as well. I had a recent discussion about gravity and atomic expansion theory with a guy who was living in London, but he was originally French, and his English was pretty good, better than mine. I'm actually fascinated with the international. I don't know, I guess cultural barrier breakdown that's happening. And I still think personally myself, and I don't know if I have any proof for this, I don't think it's the media is causing it. I think it's an energetic outside source that has a lot to do with our relationship to the difference in energy at the galactic center versus outside the galactic center. And according to Thoth's calendar, in the Mayan calendar, Quetzalcoatl, that calendar counted down to approximately the year 2012. If you started in August of 2000 or 3014 BCE, you know, we ended up in a place where they thought we were going to be going through the galactic center. Well, what if we are? I think personally, as an electrical engineer, knowing the difference in the energy at the galactic center versus outside, these meat hosts that are sensitive to energy are going to be affected in a big way. And I think that might have something to do with what we're seeing.
Right. Well, here's the thing about mysticism and science. Yeah, for example, yoga is a science of consciousness. Why? Because it's experimental, it's verifiable, right? If I teach 500 people a certain meditation technique and they can reproduce similar experience to that technique, it's a science of consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. So in a sense, I don't like to speculate because the ego likes stories, right? So on the one hand, I'm very curious, but I want to verify things directly. And when I do that, then I speak about it. Before I cannot really speak about it. But if we want to speculate, what I think is that the internet is a sign of building a collective awareness, like a swarm intelligence. And the thing is, the people in power, they slept on the internet because the internet as such is not controllable as of yet. They're trying to control the internet, right? There are several attempts passing certain laws, using pornography as an excuse to censor free speech and all that stuff. Right? This is going on. As such, it's very hard to control. Now, for example, you have the emergence of Bitcoin, so even currency is harder to control. So what you see, we have a merging of human intelligence, and it's harder to stay ignorant. Now you have, for example, when there is a crisis between Iran and Israel, you have Israelis talking to Iranis on Skype, right? So suddenly the enemy is not faceless anymore. You recognize them as humans. Everything is more relatable. So staying in a bubble is harder, and I think this has a lot to do with the transformative process.
I think you could be right. I like to speculate, but I also like to measure energies and try to get some sort of verification. But I've noticed it's been happening, and actually Terence McKenna did a really specialized collapsing calendar on the Chinese calendar and the Mayan calendar, talking about this universal consciousness that he believed it was coming as well. So I think it might just be a stage in the human development, you know.
Yes.
Sure. Well, listen, I don't want to wear you out today. It's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. Is there anything else that you want to cover before we call it quits for the day?
Maybe relating to the Terence McKenna reference, if we understand this physical experience as a form of matrix, what you see manifested in the physical is in a sense is a reflection of the state of consciousness. So the internet is a reflection of the state of consciousness in a sense that it represents in a physical sense the now interconnectedness that we become aware of. So whatever happens in consciousness, you experience a physical representation.
Right. Well, hopefully that doesn't get eliminated so that we can perpetuate this even further. Because I think it is part of the process, but I don't see, for some reason, I don't see that window being open forever. I don't know why. I just have this premonition that it's going to be open for a while, and then it's going to close. And everybody who was paying attention that wanted access to that is going to really benefit. And so, from a sharing standpoint, I think that motivates me a little bit. So.
Right. Well, here's the thing: if you're a timeless being, ultimately there's not a problem. Right? Subjectively, relatively, there's a problem. So whatever happens in this nexus of experience, ultimately we are all untouched by it. We just don't know it. Right? And then we can act from non-attachment and we can be fearless.
Right.
No matter the outcome.
Yeah. So you're going to start hang gliding now?
No.
No.
Because I have a sense of responsibility.
Oh, I see.
If I take myself out of the game too early, I cannot finish whatever I've started.
Well, you bring up a very good point, and I think a lot of times our fears mine come from, well, if I do this, it might impact my ability to keep doing this mission. And so it's and actually there are fears, internal fears that you have to face like that. They may not be real, but in order to continue your mission, some things are going to be helpful and some things are not going to be. So if you do something where you break your neck hang gliding and you can't continue your mission, you're like, okay, maybe that's irresponsible for me at this point. Right. That's good. Well, listen, Julian, it's been absolutely a pleasure, and I think we'll probably speak some more. And Julian, why don't you give everybody your website so they have it, and how to get in touch with you or to follow up and get your book, which I highly recommend. So.
Well, the thing is, I started a YouTube channel, so if people are interested in some of the things I'm speaking about, it's easy to access there, and hopefully I explain it in a way that is understandable to a lot of people. And so you can simply Google me, because I got a website, I got a book on Amazon, I got the YouTube channel. So if you just Google my name and maybe add something to it, psychotherapy, spirituality, you'll find all the information you need.
The new Eckhart Tolle.
Well, here's the thing. The ego would entertain this idea. It's not a helpful thought.
Yeah. Well, actually, I see you going beyond some of the concepts that he presented, and I think you're going to go even much further. Personally, I think you're a pioneer.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Eckhart Tolle is he's one of the greatest spiritual teachers this planet has ever seen, and I would call him the Great Gate, because he is a master at making people go through the gate, the first step. And everything from that moment on is conscious evolution, and they cannot help it but to awaken. So we owe a lot to Eckhart.
Do you see this evolution and this enlightenment state for each individual as inevitable if they live long enough?
It is absolutely inevitable.
Talk about that just for a second, and then I'm not going to keep you anymore. But I think this is really important for people to hear this.
Right, because the thing is, what I realized during one psychedelic experience where I saw how many reincarnations I had, it was about 400 that I'm conscious of. Mm-hmm. So when they spoke about the Buddha awakening, he had around 500 incarnations. This is what was written down. So the thing is, you cannot help at a certain point, you increase in a sense in spiritual mass. So this is another level of gravity that people are not aware of. We're increasing in spiritual mass. So our ability with every incarnation to break through the ego increases. We cannot help it. Enlightenment is inevitable. At a certain level of spiritual critical mass, you cannot help but you break through the illusion. So in a sense, there's nothing that we need to do. There is no urgency. But of course, and this is the beautiful thing, we can assist others in transformation, and we can, in a sense, reduce the amount of suffering that would be otherwise required to awaken.
Right. So they need just enough suffering to awaken, but no more than that, right?
Right. From that moment on, you're on the trail of conscious evolution, and as you said it, the moment you start tuning into that radio station, you cannot help it.
Yeah, I see that as well. I see that as well, and I guess did you give everybody your website? I didn't. Just have them Google you. You think is the best way? Okay, Julian Polzin is how you spell your last name. Polzin, right? Okay, Julian. Well, this is. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to publish the video, of course, you can add the website in the description, maybe.
Okay, I'll do that. Well, Julian, it's been fantastic talking to you, and you have a great day there in wherever you are in Europe. Okay, I didn't specify. Okay, bye now.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye now.